Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. My guest today, Alisa Del Tufo, was one of the first people to understand the magnitude of family violence, and she has devoted most of her life to its prevention and elimination. We're still far from eliminating it, right?
That's for sure.
But we're trying to prevent it.
Oh, we are definitely trying to prevent it.
The term family violence is an all-inclusive term. What does it cover?
Well, it covers certainly the abuse of adult women in the home and child abuse. We are trying harder and harder to link those two issues. They used to be considered completely separate family issues. It also includes the abuse of elders. And we're trying to look at violence in the family as an integrated set of problems rather than isolated ones, because I don't think you can have one person in a family abused without it affecting everybody else.
So when you say you're trying to link child abuse and domestic violence, what we really, and battering of
the mother's
partner, we're not trying to link it. It is linked.
It is linked, right.
We're trying to understand the linkage.
Right.
And I've worked with you on that.
Yes,
and I
you
guess
have.
I should tell the viewers that I also chair the board of the organization in which you are a founder and a co-director, Connect, which is a wonderful organization on the front line of prevention and early intervention. But let's go, we've had so many recent tragedies. And I must admit, my first thought when I hear about a child being abused is that the mother must be abused. It's not clear in some of the cases if that's true.
Right.
But it takes a long time to discover that also, doesn't it?
Well, I think we've tried very hard over the last 15 years or so to make assessment for adult domestic violence part of the normal practice of child welfare, because it's been shown in studies in New York and around the country that at least half of the child welfare cases there's adult woman abuse as well.
So when the Agency for Children's Services is called in and a social worker goes to the family, and it's because of domestic vience, or is it because, no, it's because of
It's because
abuse,
of a report of child
maltreatment,
abuse,
or neglect.
Right.
They're now training, and actually you designed a program for that training to see if there isn't also violence against the woman, the mother.
We're trying to, and in theory, ACS has adopted what is called universal screening for domestic violence, which means every time they go and do an investigation, no matter what the charges are, for example, it could be educational neglect, which is one of the common charges and the ones we've seen in these last cases, they're supposed to also assess whether the woman is being battered. Now, we don't have any data, however, out of ACS to see how frequently they actually comply with that, and we don't have any real qualitative understanding about whether the social workers are doing a good job in assessing for domestic violence.
Why do they call it educational neglect when the child is out of school, but also, is that because they don't necessarily come to school with bruises or black eyes as some of these children did?
Yeah, educational neglect only means that the child has missed a certain number of days, and I'm not even sure if they have a minimum number of days, but it's sort of like,
that's a warning. It's used as a warning.
Exactly. I mean, if you have a fever, which to me is sort of like saying educational neglect. You have a fever because something else is going on in your body. There's educational neglect because something else is going on in the family. And when we first, in 1993, tried to convince then SSC, I think, Special Services for Children, to use a pilot, to do a pilot program and screen for domestic violence, they agreed, but they wanted to eliminate all the educational neglect cases. They didn't want to screen in domestic violence because they're like, well, this is educational neglect. Why should we screen for domestic violence? And we were like, well, you know, there's some reason why that mom isn't getting that child to school. Don't you want to know what that reason is? And in a lot of cases, it's domestic violence.
So at the same time, does the police department do any training so that when they respond to the calls, either for domestic violence, that they look for child abuse, or when they are sent out, as they were recently on child abuse, that they look for domestic violence?
Under the 1995 Omnibus Family Violence Act that the state of New York passed, domestic violence and child abuse were linked under the heading of family violence. And when the police respond to a domestic dispute, they are supposed to assess as to whether the children are being abused. It doesn't happen. It opened a floodgate and created a huge set of problems that we predicted, but we couldn't get anyone to pay attention to. But on the other hand, I think when you look at the number of calls to the State Central Registry by the New York City Police Department, at least in the late 90s, it was about between 1,500 and 2,000 calls to the State Central Registry each year from the New York City Police Department. They respond, however, to 250,000 approximately domestic disputes. So one can only imagine that they're only reporting child welfare issues in a very, very small percentage of those cases. In some senses, I think that's good, because when they were reporting child abuse, it created a whole other set of problems.
Then they took children out of the homes and put them in foster care, right?
Right, or often they would arrest both parents, and they would put both parents in jail for the courts to decide who was the guilty party, and the children would end up in foster care.
And that led to a big court case,
lawsuit,
the Nicholson case?
That's correct.
But that was in the federal court.
Yes.
And that now, is ACS still operating under the recommendations or the supervision of the court?
It took many years to get to this point, and ACS went through many changes to get to the point where they are no longer under the court's supervision for domestic violence cases. But it doesn't preclude attorneys from going back in and suing again. But the ACS is no longer under the injunction.
What did it say? What was the Nicholson decision? Just briefly,
the decision in brief was that ACS was re-victimizing battered mothers when they removed children from otherwise non-abusing parents. So the contention was that many battered mothers are not the ones abusing their children, it's the abusive father. And by removing the children and putting them into foster care, they were not acknowledging the fact that the mother was actually the protective parent. It was the father that was abusing them, and they could no longer do that. So then
that raises another problem, and all of this is so interrelated as stepping stones. So if you let the mother stay with the children, and taking the children in the care of the mother, and they have to leave the abuser, where do they go?
Right.
Where do they go?
Well, they often go into a battered women's shelter. They sometimes enter the general homeless system, and sometimes they go stay with a friend or a relative.
But it's difficult, isn't it, for them to be in a battered women's shelter? I mean, there aren't that many beds,
no,
are there?
They're often, I think the recent data is that for a third of the women that call for domestic violence shelter, there's no space for them. There's been an enormous increase in the number of domestic violence shelter beds in the city, but it never keeps pace with the need for the services.
When I was in the city council, the thoughts were on the part of the administration that there were many women with children who were entering the homeless system and saying they were battered in order to get accommodations.
Right.
And therefore they were turning away a good number of people who were validly claiming the violence. Is that still the case? They've changed the whole system.
They've changed the whole system enormously, but there's still a lot of issues around what kind of proof does a woman have to have of her domestic violence to be able to be admitted to the general homeless. There have been cases where a battered woman has shown up at the EAU to try to get into a homeless shelter, and the intake worker has actually called her abuser and said, Catherine is here with the 2 kids. She's saying she doesn't have any place to live. Is that true? And because for a while, EAU was only accepting domestic incident reports or active orders of protection as proof that this person was battered.
When they call the batterer, that's so insidious and so bad, because we've learned that batterers are controllers, and the one thing they don't want is for the victim to leave. And so they follow them and come after them, and they really threaten them, and then we see the ultimate is when they kill somebody.
Right, exactly.
When we first met, which was many years ago, and I know you said we met at Barnard College, but we met over the discussion. How many years ago was that? It was in the early 80s, so it's over 20 years ago. There was this tension between child advocates and domestic violence advocates, and they didn't work together, right? So was Head and Nussbaum the first time that we did work with that?
It was the time that it really became a front and center issue, I think. For me personally, although when I ran a battered women's program, we did a lot for children.
You
and
founded Sanctuary for Families.
That's
right?
correct. I founded Sanctuary for Families. And we had, I think, the first children's services program in the city, and tried to work with the city's child welfare system around safety issues. But it was the child welfare system at that time had no incentive, no reason, no particular policies that allowed us to really work with them. So that was very frustrating and difficult. When Lisa Steinberg was killed and Hedda Nussbaum's face was all over the media, it created a need on both sides of the aisle, if you want to look at it that way, to really start finding ways that there could be more collaboration. And it hasn't been easy. But I personally have spent a large part of my career really trying to make those connections more real.
How did you start with all of this? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Paramus, New Jersey, and I sort of have a circuitous route, really. I went to college and became a philosophy and religion major, although that wasn't my original intent, and studied Tibetan Buddhism, of all things, and spent a lot of time in Asia living with Tibetans, and had thought I would go on to get a PhD in Tibetan studies, and realized, though, when I went to live in Asia, that what was particularly interesting to me was, I mean, the religion and its philosophy was very interesting to me, but what was more compelling to me was how people interpreted their belief systems and lived their day-to-day lives, how they got along with each other, how they didn't get along with each other, how they resolved conflict. And so that changed my interests and my desires of what I was going to do, and I ended up going to Union Theological Seminary here in New York City and studying psychology and religion, but becoming very active in women's issues, and helped start the St. Luke's, now St. Luke's Roosevelt Rape Crisis Center, worked in a women's collective, and got very involved in women's crisis intervention and anti-violence work.
It has certainly been, it's benefited from your interest. I mean, you have been incredible in trying to go beyond just finding a bed or taking care of an immediate thing, to really look at the basic deep roots of this and how we really can do something about it. We talk about ACS all the time, or the police department.
Right.
There are many, so we give the impression that domestic violence only happens in poor families.
Right.
It's not true.
No, it's not true at all. What I like
Hedda
to say
Nussbaum, of course,
was
not.
a very
Yes.
well-to-do, that was
a successful woman.
Right, and Joel had a lot of money coming in. What I like to say is that it happens across the board, but that the poorer you are, the more difficult it is to resolve the problem. So you find that poor women tend to suffer from the violence for longer periods of time because they don't have any resources to get out. They don't have airfare to go fly and live with their sister in Toledo, or money to just go get another apartment or spend some time in a hotel. They don't have the money to go to a private doctor or pay a private attorney to get a divorce. And so the poorer you are, the more entrapped you are. And so I think that is that's clearly a big part of the dynamic. There is a lot of data coming out now, though, that does tie economic insecurity to higher rates of violence overall and higher rates of domestic violence.
Connect runs a program for batterers.
We actually run a program that trains people to run programs for batterers.
Many years ago, I remember during the Karen Straw case, which was another case of a woman who had taken all the steps. You know, we should just quickly say that the police department used to, when they'd respond to a call, the police would take somebody, walk them around the block, say it's not really nice to be your friend, your wife or something, and then bring them. You promise you're not going to do it? Yeah, I promise, and then come back. So Karen was had 2 children. She got an order of protection. She'd called the local precinct 7 or 8 times, and still, when she moved out, and then her husband came and raped her in front of the children, and she stabbed him and killed him, and she was on trial for murder, and she was acquitted. But that raised, now why am I saying this? That raised a question of what happens, where do you go, how do you find this advice? but also what is actually, at that time, this is what I was trying, at that time, programs for batterers were frowned upon.
They're still,
you remember that?
Yeah, they still are controversial because they don't.
I can't remember if Karen's husband was in. I don't think he was in. No, I don't think so.
I don't think that he was. But I mean, one thing I wanted to say, because I think it's important for people to recognize, is that most women who are abused try very hard to stop the violence, either through counseling or leaving or calling the police or getting orders of protection. But most of the time, those interventions and hope, right, and trying to manage the way their family runs so that the batterer won't get angry. But most of those things don't have the desired effect, which is stopping the violence. And most women are seriously injured or killed when they are leaving, or when they've tried to leave, or right after they've left. So this sort of knee-jerk response that some people have, like, well, why doesn't she leave, is completely counterintuitive to the way battered women have to survive. So, and clearly that's true for Karen Straw and many other women that end up getting murdered, sadly enough.
But batterers.
Okay.
It stands to, I mean, I don't think it needs much study to know that the more stress you're under, the more you're going to act it out.
Right.
So, in a way,
unemployment, substance abuse, large families with a lot of young children, problems with homelessness, all those issues add stresses and add to the possibility that there's going to be violence.
That is not necessarily the cause or the issue. I remember when we had the hearings up at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, where we had women testify who were serving time for having killed their batterers. How many of them said it was part of life? I mean, the women especially said, the first time my husband hit me, I thought that's what marriage was, because my father always hit my mother. And I think, and they do have, there are studies and much evidence that abused children can be abusers or battered. It's an inherited thing.
Right. They say that boys who are battered have 1,000 times more chances of growing up to be batterers than boys who aren't in violent homes. And I'm not sure what the ratio is for girls. I think it's somewhat different. But it clearly is a learned behavior, and it's learned not only in your home, but it's learned in the larger society, where really I don't think that we really have social condemnation of domestic violence in the ways that we need to if we're going to really begin to start changing the way men treat women and children. And so batterers programs are still controversial because, at least in New York City, most of the batterers programs that exist are court mandated, which means that this particular batterer who's referred to the program has to have been arrested and brought to criminal court and been adjudicated and sent to the... That means that a lot of violence has taken place before he gets to that point. And the types of batterers intervention programs that the court runs are very they're not deep. They're educational. I'm not saying that that's wrong. They don't want the man to express himself. It's about changing his knowledge base about who women are, who men are, what the behavior is, that it's illegal, all these kinds of things. But if it's such a deep behavior, if it's deep in you from your own upbringing and it's deep in the culture, I don't think you're going to change many people's minds by a 26-week educational course where you could basically sleep through the whole thing as long as you show up. All you have to do is show up. I think that there needs to be a lot more diverse kinds of work with men. I think it needs to go on for longer. I think it needs to be tied into their own upbringing and their own role as fathers.
When it comes to their parents, it starts early childhood and very beginning. This has also been affected by the influx of people from other cultures and other countries, where there are different cultures that still allow and don't frown on the violence in the family, right?
Yeah, as I like to say, it's about patriarchy, but different cultures or different societies have different tolerance for patriarchy, and I think that's the common theme, because I've never met a woman or a man from any culture where, culturally speaking, domestic violence is completely cut at the roots from the very beginning of a person's life. For the most part, children are allowed to be beaten and women are allowed to be beaten, and even in this culture.
Do you know anything about Sikhs?
Not very much.
I wondered if because they have a wonderful attitude and feeling about women, and I wondered, I don't know what they are about children, we'll have to look into that. You've devised programs that Connect Now is doing, and they're designed to really bring us to the next level of more community involvement in it. Explain what your feelings are about the programs and what you think the future brings to us.
I think that we have done a lot in the last 25 years to change systems. Every public system in New York City and pretty much every child welfare and police system and homeless system across the country has policies on the books about domestic violence. They are interpreted poorly or well depending on the local kind of checks and balances system. But we've done a lot of work in that area. We've also created a lot of services. There are battered women's shelters. There are non-residential services. There are legal services. Hotlines. And I'm not saying they're enough, but those are things that we all
things that have developed in the last 25 years.
They're there. We expect them to be there. We fund them. We know that they need to exist. We know that they need to be expanded. But what we don't have is we don't have initiatives that are really addressing public awareness and consciousness so that we begin to change the way people feel about family violence, so that it doesn't get to the point where women need to run away from their home with their kids in the middle of the night and all their possessions in a black plastic bag. We're trying to change...
Or children get
killed or taken into foster care is the only possible solution to the problem.
That's what happened with Nick's Mary, right?
That's right.
Because people knew.
They did know, and I think that it's interesting that we are seeing more concern about how the community responds to these problems. In every case where a child has died or a woman has died recently, some coworker or person that goes to church or next door neighbor or grandmother or in-law says, I knew something was wrong, I didn't know what to do, I'm not sure what to do, it's his family, da-da-da. So we need to break down those taboos about talking about the problem, educating people about the problem, intervening in safe ways. I mean, we're not expecting people to bang down the door and say, leave that child alone, but we are expecting that members of the community, both professionals and neighbors, begin to understand violence in the family in a different way and raise their intolerance towards it and find community-based ways.
So tell us what the programs are that we're now trying to do.
Well, we are working in 3 communities in New York City to develop the capacity of those communities to respond to violence in the family, which means that we partner with community-based organizations, with tenant organizations, with healthcare providers. We don't focus on the domestic violence providers because they're already doing this job. We focus on everybody else in the community that are the fabric of what makes that community. And we tend to work a lot with organizations that I call the natural community. Those are places that you go because you want to go, not places you go because you have to go. So we expect that to be people's faith community, Head Start programs, health centers, food pantries, hair braiding, hair salons, so that we are helping those community groups understand domestic violence and know how to recognize the signs and intervene in an earlier way.
And to set up some kind of a network within a supportive
network. To set up a network. So we work with the organizations to develop their services within their organization. So when someone comes in and they see that they're suffering from domestic violence, they know what to do for them. And we're just working in the community to try to raise awareness amongst the public around the problem.
So what do you think the future is going to be? We have about 2.5 minutes to discuss this future.
Well, I believe that if we're ever going to make a dent really in domestic violence, because if you notice 250,000 calls to the police have been pretty consistent over the last 10 years.
And there must be many more.
There are many more. I think that that's about 10 to 15% of the total problem. But if we're going to really decrease the numbers and stop this insidious and horrible cycle, we're going to have to find ways of bringing people around to thinking that violence is wrong. We have to find ways of working with children and families when children are very young.
Or prenatal.
Prenatal. We have to have programs in schools for young people to try to educate them. Victims are becoming younger and younger. I mean, girls of 15 and 16 are calling for shelter because they don't have, their boyfriends are beating them up and there's no alternative. There are ways of trying to get the abusive boyfriend relocated to different schools, but all of this is very new and very painful right now. There's no real good system. The child welfare system doesn't really provide services to children and families around domestic violence yet. That's something that they need to do. The faith community needs to take a lot of responsibility about this. I can't tell you how many women report that they were beaten for the first time on their wedding night, and if we look at that and look at the fact that religious institutions are sanctifying this union, and then that is almost the go card for domestic battery, that's an important subject to look at. So we need to create public health campaigns, we need to educate people about it, and we need to bring the resources into people's communities.
And do you see the opportunities to do that?
Well, Connect has been generously funded by the New York City Council for 4 years now. This will be our 5th year that we're asking for. I think the federal government is beginning to look at prevention campaigns more seriously. The new Violence Against Women Act, which is the federal act, has for the first time prevention provisions in it, so there might be some federal funding for these kinds of things. And yes, I think that the domestic violence community has realized that criminal justice, sanctions, and shelter are not the only solutions to the problem.
So Alisa, you're inspiring, and I hope that people who listen will follow, and that we will develop the system that will bring peace to households and children and women and men.
That's right.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.